And these systems cannot exist unless an organized entity, an intelligent organizer, created them. For chaos can never lead to organization. Chaos or disorganization leads to chaos and disharmony. And the one word that I pull out from these ayahs that you see up there, that I don't expect you to read right now, is harmony. And that is really the theme of, or the vertebrae of the talk that I'm going to give. So I'm going to just start off by saying that we have a nutrient security problem. A lot of people will talk to you about food security and how the world is awash in hunger. Yes, the world does have a hunger problem, but that is not a food security problem. That is a distribution problem. The world right now is more sick than it has ever been on Earth today. Couple of statistics. 99.3, remember this, 99.3% of U.S. farmland is sprayed with pesticides. There were 6.6 million farms in the United States 100 years ago. Today there's 5 million less. We have 1.7 million farms today. Food was on the table in minutes or hours from the farms that were right next door because we lived in agrarian societies. Today, food on average takes 5 to 15 days and sometimes months to land on our plate. And the last one, in the US, 1 in 2 women and 1 in 3 men will develop cancer in their lifetime. Doesn't mean that they'll die, but they will experience cancer. 100 years ago, that number was 1 in 8,000. But let me introduce you to someone. Meet me. That was me when I had just graduated school and I was working on Wall Street in banking. As far back as I can remember, in my pre-adolescence, I was sick. I used to suffer from things like headaches. And I used to either sleep it off or maybe pop a pill. Fast forward a number of years, and when I graduated, by that time, this time which you see the guy on the right, the sick-looking guy, my headaches had gotten so debilitating that I had to go to the ER multiple times every time I got a migraine because of these migraine headaches. And I used to beg for Demerol or codeine, some sort of a narcotic to make the pain go away. And then there was the eczema. Well, it didn't start off as eczema. It started off as dry skin in my pre-adolescence. And that dry skin, by that time, had turned so chronic that when I used to pick up my briefcase, my palms would tear. The eczema was in patches on my body, but it was the worst on my palms. And when I used to shake my hands, and of course you have to shake hands when you're in banking or in a corporate environment, I used to cup my hands like this so that people wouldn't feel it, because if they felt it, they probably would have been like, oh my God, what's wrong with this guy? So I left banking in 2007, and I went up to Toronto, and I started looking into my own health. And somebody gave me minerals, and I got better after a few months. And I'm like, what are minerals, and where do they come from? The short answer is they come from food, or they're supposed to. And that began my journey of looking into food, farming, soil, what drives health, and the intersection of health and soil, basically. What I found mortified me. Our health actually begins in the soil. The soil is the skin of the earth. If we take care of it, it'll take care of us. If we don't take care of it, it will not take care of us. So a teaspoon or a handful of soil in your hand contains billions and billions of microbes. And these microbes all have jobs to do. Just like your gut microbiome has microbes in it that take care of you, an imbalance can because they play such a central role in our health, an imbalance can cause an imbalance in the health. So now I want you to imagine that there's an acre of the soil, this handful of soil across a piece of land. Billions and billions of microbes. Now imagine 2 acres. Now imagine a hectare. We're talking about galaxies and galaxies of microbes. And they all have jobs to do under the soil. So, what is soil? Well, I want you to imagine a city like Austin or New York. And people sometimes call it living soil. Sometimes people call it a living city. But what gives a city its livingness? Well, if you think about a city, it has these smooth roads, cars are going on it, electricity and water is pulsating through the veins of the city. And then there are people. And there are people on it that all have different professions. There's doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc. That's what gives it, the city, its livingness. Now, if we took one example, let's say doctors, and we eliminated doctors from a city, what would happen? Well, nothing would happen in the first week or the first month. You know, you get a smattering of sickness here or sickness there. But eventually, over months and months, perhaps a year, the city would turn chaotic. People would be getting sick, plumbers would be getting sick, and then, the whole city would just become disrupted. So in the same way, I want you to think of soil like a city. Soil is actually made up of inanimate, just like buildings in the city, structure. So clay, sand, it's joined together by different things like fungi and exudates. And then there's these microbes. Just like a city has professions, doctors, lawyers, and they all have jobs to do, the soil gets its livingness from the fungi network, which are the roads, and the microbes, which give it its livingness. There are 150,000 different types of microbial species in the ground. And we only have 10% of the knowledge of what the soil has. So imagine what they do. I'll give you one example of one type of soil microbe. When the plant is growing inside the soil, and its roots are extended inside the soil, it says, I need some nitrogen. So there's a bacteria or a microbe called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So when the plant asks for it, I won't get into how it asks for it, but it's quite fascinating. The microbe rises to the surface, breaks down atmospheric nitrogen, brings it to the plant root. When the plant is done sipping it, it returns it back into the nitrogen. It returns it back into the air. Now, if we eliminated it from the soil, then there would be an imbalance, just like the elimination of doctors from the soil, from a city. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. Around the turn of the century, actually before the turn of the century, biologists began playing around with different elements and different inputs or sprayings into the soil. One of them was nitrogen. And what they found was that when you spray or input nitrogen into the soil with plants growing in it, the plants grow faster. So now visually, you're able to see plants growing faster and bigger. And if you look at this chart, the chart really took off after the industrial era and really after the First World War. Around the industrial era, farmers were being left behind. And as they were being left behind, they began more so playing around with nitrogen and other things and other elements to ignite the plants and increase yield, which is a huge word that you hear about today. So when you do this, you create, so before I talk about this, let's talk about heroin. What is heroin? Heroin's a drug. If you take it, you might feel good one day, you might feel good the next week, you might feel good for a month or two, but eventually, if you keep taking it, the heroin, it will lead to sickness. The person who looks like a drug addict is usually sickly looking, has bad skin, they might have issues with their gut, they might have issues with headaches. So if that person comes to a doctor and says, I have a headache, and he's a heroin addict, the doctor is going to give them a pill. The obvious answer is remove the heroin shot and the guy will get better. So let's talk nitrogen. When you add nitrogen, all of a sudden, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are looking up and saying, oh, wow, there's an abundance of nitrogen inside the soil. We don't have to do anything. And so they die off. And when that happens, because everything is interconnected, systems are Allah's world, ecosystems, solar systems, these are all interconnected. It has a downward vicious cycle effect. So, first of all, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria die off. Then other dependent microbes or aspects of the soil begin to get affected. And then what happens is the plant shows up, and the plant gets weaker, or the plant may look sickly. And so, what the corporations then do, again, this was by the 1940s, the corporations had taken over. What the corporations then do, oh my God, the plant is looking kind of sick. Let's make it look better. And they started playing around with the cocktails of the inputs into the soil, and those cocktails became even more sophisticated. So remember, these people that are looking at plants and growing plants are growing plants by looking at the visuals. Eventually, they got into the microscopy, but they were looking at the visuals. So now, and this is really probably the most important chart that I'm going to talk about here. So a plant is so smart that it can show you that visually it's looking good, but there are other things that it gives off to defend itself. So if a predator is coming like a rabbit, it can literally call an army of insects to help defend it. It can call even rabbits, for instance. So plants have defense mechanisms already built into them as long as a plant is healthy. If the plant is not healthy, and this is something that we cannot see with our naked eye, then the plant will get attacked. So now the plant is getting attacked by an insect or a fly or a bug or a pest. What do the corporations do? Oh my God, the plant is getting attacked by an insect. Let's create an insecticide medicine. Let's create a pesticide medicine. And then they found out, when they started spraying it, they found out, oh, the plant is dying because of the chemical warfare that's being spread onto the plant. So then what they started doing is they started getting into genetic modification. And this is where the whole GMO stuff is coming from. So what they're doing is they're injecting the genetics of the pesticide into the seed so that the plant won't die when that pesticide is sprayed on them. So now when when somebody comes and says, oh, this is sprayed with pesticides, let's just wash it off. That doesn't make any sense because it's inside the plant. You cannot wash off pesticides. It's part of the plant. There's more, but I'm going to stop here on this one. So what's happened in this grand movement with these chemical companies, they've started to become more and more sophisticated in the cocktails and the applications to grow plants. They're not growing plants. They're actually just growing whatever you want to call it, frankenplants. They're not really food. It looks like a plant, it walks like a plant, but it doesn't have the health of a plant. 100 years ago, there were thousands of seed companies out there. We are now left with 4 agrochemical giants that control the seeds in the world. The driver behind this is centralized. The driver behind this centralization of control of seeds is the way cities are being developed. So by 2050, 66% of the population will live in 50 megacities. It's probably going to be more than that. So the priority for them, city planners and real estate developers, is to lay ever-expanding concrete where feeding people is a secondary consideration. The easy answer for feeding people is to drop a Walmart or a Costco. But when Walmart goes to a small farmer and says, hey, small farmer, I need 1,000 heads of lettuces because I need to feed these people, the small farmer goes, I can't do that. They get marginalized and they go to these big factory farms. That's what a factory farm is. Somebody who can satisfy Walmart. The current paradigm for cities is that we take Earth's resources, we use it up in the city, and we spit it out. The consequence to that is that 100 years ago, this is just one example, or this is 10 examples of vegetables, but this is across the food taxonomy. All foods are affected. Imagine 497 different varieties of lettuce, and now we have only less than 30 in the world. This is probably the chart that you should be most concerned about, especially for those people who are 50 or below. For the last 4 decades, the life expectancy ranking of the United States population has been dropping. 4 decades. And over the last 5 years, the US in life expectancy has reached a tipping point where the highest life expectancy was 5 years ago, and now life expectancy is dropping. The key reason behind this is food. So just to recap, and I'll go through this really quickly, the agrarian age ended. There was no chronic disease 100 years ago. We started experiencing exponential fertilization or inputs into the soil. Cities continued to expand. Population continued to get concentrated and move into cities. And that drove centralization of farming, that drove the Walmart or the big box movement. And we experienced the loss of a small farmer. So again, 6.6 million farms, we're down 5 million farms. Machines grow our food. As I mentioned, genetics have taken a hold, chemicals, sophisticated cocktails. 99% of the US land is being treated with a pesticide, and now we are sitting with the highest rates of chronic disease ever that Earth has experienced across the world. This is not just a US problem. This is the city of tomorrow, where we take Earth's resources, we use them up in a way that we return more back to the Earth than we took. So what am I doing? What I've done is, in my view of my new world, is I'm trying to solve for food. And what I mean by that is, if we eat the right food, literally we can, so let me just describe this first, what you're looking at. I help people grow organic food indoors. So what I've done is I've created a product called Tiny Farm. Think of it like a Nespresso or a Keurig for fresh salads. It's completely automatic, and it sits on your countertop or against the wall, and it can be built up, and it comes in different sizes. It's completely modular. The key aspect to this product is that I make soil. And I make soil as if you were eating from soil 100 years ago. I might take up, now this is not a very big piece, I might take up 12 to 20% of your plate, but I'm getting you 80+% of your nutrients. Remember what I said earlier, we don't have a food security problem, we have a nutrient security problem. So I'll leave it here, and next week, you're probably going to be asking, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff wrong in the food world. What are we supposed to do? And we as Muslims can do a lot. As I said, we wrote the book on it. Well, Allah wrote the book on it. And we are the stewards of that book. We can't just turn our eyes and say, oh, it didn't happen. It wasn't sprayed. And just because the right amount of spices are put on, and just because it might taste good, and it doesn't really taste good, actually, that food fills our tummies, but it's not filling our cells with the correct nutrients. So I'll leave it here and hope to see you guys next week. inshallah.